Jamaica, Easter, 1760. The island stood like a jewel in the Caribbean Sea, but its beauty was carved out of bone and blood. Beneath the blazing sun, waves of cane fields stretched across the land, their stalks taller than men, their sweetness masking centuries of cruelty. For the empire, sugar was gold. For those bound to its harvest, sugar was chains. Among the thousands shackled in the island's belly, one man carried a past unlike the rest. His name was Tacky. Once, across the ocean in West Africa, he had been a chief of the Akan, a man of wisdom, wealth, and power, who wore gold and spoke with the authority of lineage. But ships had stolen him from that world, pressing his body into iron, pressing his soul into darkness. In Jamaica, he walked not as a chief but as property, yet even in bondage, fragments of his authority clung to him. The other enslaved men looked at him with quiet reverence. He did not bow easily. His silence was weightier than another man's words. The sugar plantations were prisons without walls. At dawn, horns blared, dragging men and women from cramped huts where sleep came only in broken fragments. The overseers waited with whips coiled in their hands, their eyes colder than steel. The fields swallowed the slaves whole. Thousands bent over, swinging hoes, cutting cane, their bodies slick with sweat, their backs striped from lashes. Hours bled into one another beneath the punishing sun. The cane itself seemed to mock them, its sweetness feeding the empire while their own mouths tasted only salt and ash. Meals came as scraps: salted fish from barrels, coarse plantains, thin porridge. Hunger gnawed constantly, but worse than hunger was exhaustion. Men collapsed from fever or sunstroke, and the overseer's answer was the lash. Women staggered under loads too heavy, their cries muffled by threats of further punishment. Children watched and learned that the whip, not the sky, governed their fates. Night offered no peace. The fields were dark, the air filled with the groans of bodies torn and broken. From the slave huts rose the sound of hymns, some borrowed from the master's churches, others older songs carried across the sea, songs of Akan warriors, of ancestors, of spirits that refused to be silenced. Shackles clinked as men shifted on the hard dirt floors, while women rocked infants who would inherit nothing but bondage. In the distance, planters feasted, their houses glowing with candlelight, their laughter carried on the wind like a cruel echo. Tacky walked among his people with the bearing of someone who remembered freedom. His eyes were steady, his steps deliberate. He said little, but when he did, others listened. They whispered that he had once commanded warriors. They whispered that he had not forgotten. In a world designed to crush identity, he carried his like a hidden blade. Oppression weighed heavier with each passing day. The lash cracked louder. The demands for sugar grew harsher, and the bodies of the enslaved were pushed past breaking. Women violated by masters bore children that carried no name but property. Men whose arms could swing a machete were reduced to cutting cane until their muscles burned. The empire's hunger was endless, and Jamaica was its feast. But beneath the surface, something stirred. The silence of the fields was not empty, it was watchful. Tacky's presence was a reminder that not all memory had been erased, not all dignity had been broken. He carried the Akan traditions in his veins, the warrior's pride in his heart. His people saw it, felt it, drew strength from it. Sometimes when the overseers turned their backs, men would lift their eyes from the cane and glance toward him. Sometimes in the huts at night, his shadow would linger in the firelight and the whispers would thicken like smoke. He did not need to speak of rebellion. His very existence spoke it for him. The planters believed they had broken these men and women, that the whip and the sermon had silenced them. But the empire never truly understood what it tried to own. In the marrow of those shackled bones lived gods and ancestors who did not bow. In the darkness of the huts, plans could take root like seeds buried in soil. Easter was approaching, a holy day for the masters, a time of feasting, prayer, and ceremony. They looked forward to it with complacent arrogance, certain that their slaves would bend lower, sing louder, and offer reverence to the god of their chains. Yet in the huts, Easter meant something else. It meant gathering, shadows moving silently, promises spoken in tongues the planters could not understand. The empire demanded silence, but silence had begun to crack. Beneath hymns, other songs rose, songs of battle, of vengeance, of spirits restless for blood. Tacky stood at the center of it all, outwardly obedient, inwardly unyielding. His body bent to the fields, but his mind sharpened like the machetes hidden in plain sight. For the planters, these were tools of labor. For the enslaved, they were weapons in waiting. Every swing at the cane was practice. Every cut through stalks was a rehearsal. The nights grew heavier with whispers. The overseers noticed small things missing: a knife, a length of rope, a tool that vanished from the shed. They thought it theft for survival, nothing more. But in the huts, survival was no longer the only thought. There were darker dreams, sharper hungers rising with every lash, every hunger pang, every body broken in the cane fields. In the silence of those nights, Tacky became more than a man. He became a symbol, a shadow carrying memory across oceans, across chains. The Akan chief had not been erased. He had only been waiting. And so the fields bent under the sun, the huts shook with hymns, the whips cracked, and the planters feasted. Yet the island trembled with a secret it could not yet name, because within those fields, beneath the weight of empire, something stirred. What began as silence would end in screams. Night fell heavy on Jamaica in the spring of 1760. The cane fields, so loud in the day with the clatter of machetes and the crack of whips, grew still beneath the moon. Yet silence did not mean peace. Beneath that silence, in the huts where bodies lay crumpled from exhaustion, another rhythm stirred, a rhythm of whispers, of songs carried on hushed breath, of a rebellion slowly shaping itself like a storm just beyond the horizon. The enslaved gathered in secret, away from the overseer's eyes, speaking in tongues the planters could not decipher. Akan songs drifted in the night, their melodies ancient, their words layered with meanings hidden from those who owned their bodies but not their minds. To the masters, these were just strange chants, the mournful music of heathens. But to those who understood, the songs were instructions, prayers and warnings woven into one. Each verse was a message passed hand to hand, ear to ear, heart to heart. Restlessness infected the huts like a fever. Men who had once bowed their heads now looked toward the shadows where Tacky stood. Women rocked their children with lullabies that were not lullabies at all, but stories of warriors, ancestors, and gods who struck down oppressors. The empire thought it had beaten defiance out of them, but rebellion was a fire that smoldered under ash. Every lash of the whip was another breath feeding the flame. Small acts of defiance began to mark the days. Tools went missing from sheds: axes, machetes, knives once used for cane cutting. Overseers cursed and accused, but none confessed. At first it was a machete here, a knife there. Then whole bundles of tools disappeared, as though swallowed by the earth itself. Cane fields that once stretched in perfect green rows sometimes turned black overnight. Patches burned by unseen hands. Livestock went missing. Food was stolen from the master's stores, and charms appeared buried in the dirt. Bundles of feathers, bones, and blood meant to call upon spirits for protection and vengeance. The overseers whispered among themselves that the slaves were restless, that something was stirring. Yet they dismissed it with arrogance, blind in their belief that the lash could cure all disobedience. What they did not see was that the lash itself was what fueled the storm. Strange omens began to spread like rumors carried on the wind. An overseer's dog was found one morning with its throat slit, its blood staining the dirt near the edge of the fields. No one had seen who had done it, but all knew it was not accident. The dog had been feared among the slaves, a beast set upon them when they slowed or when runaways were hunted. Now it lay silent, its jaws slack, its eyes glassy. The overseer raged, but among the huts whispers grew louder. The spirits had struck, and the first blood had been a warning. It was said that Obeah men and women, keepers of old magic, had begun blessing machetes in the dead of night. The blades, dipped in herbs and blood, were whispered over with prayers that called upon ancestors long dead. The spirits of Africa, the gods of the Akan, were being invited into the struggle. The machetes gleamed, not only with steel, but with vengeance made sacred. For the masters, they were farm tools. For the enslaved, they had become holy instruments of justice. Easter approached, and with it tension thickened in the air. For the planters, it was a holy time of Christ's resurrection, a day of candles and sermons, of feasting and celebration. But for those in the huts, Easter took on another meaning. If Christ had risen from the grave, so too could freedom rise from the fields. The empire's sacred day would be painted in the blood of those who had built their power on broken backs. Men gathered in the shadows, swearing oaths of secrecy. Women pressed herbs into their palms for strength. The whispers hardened into plans. Machetes were sharpened in silence, their edges honed until they could cut through cane and flesh. Torches were hidden, wrapped in cloth, waiting for the night they would blaze. Leaders rose quietly from among the enslaved, and at their center stood Tacky, his presence steady, his eyes like iron in the firelight. They spoke of what was to come not in grand speeches, but in fragments, in whispers carried from hut to hut. Easter, they said. When they pray, we strike. When they feast, we burn. The plans spread across plantations like smoke. Hundreds swore themselves to the cause, each man and woman carrying the weight of vengeance, each bound not by paper or seal, but by blood and silence. Even the air seemed heavier as Easter drew nearer. Overseers noticed the silence, a quiet too deep to be natural. They beat harder, threatened more, but the enslaved bent their heads and worked, hiding their rage behind lowered eyes. What the planters saw was obedience. What they missed was the way hands lingered on machetes, the way glances met in unspoken agreement, the way silence was no longer submission, but anticipation. The island trembled with what it did not yet know. The masters believed Easter would pass as it always had. Sermons in whitewashed chapels, feasts laid out on long wooden tables, their voices rising in hymns of triumph. But among the huts, a different hymn was being prepared, one sung not with voices but with blades. The cane stalks swayed in the wind, their rustling like whispers too faint to catch. In their shadows, men sharpened steel. Women buried charms in the dirt to bind the spirits to their cause. Children, too young to fight, were taught to keep secrets in silence. Every heart beat faster, every night grew longer. The land itself seemed to wait, as though it knew that blood was coming, and so the empire slept in its arrogance, dreaming of sugar and gold. But beneath those dreams, the enslaved dreamed of something else. Easter would not be a day of feasting alone. It would be a day of reckoning. For the empire, Easter meant resurrection. For the enslaved, Easter would mean rebellion. What began as whispers would end in fire. The night before Easter in 1760 hung thick with a silence that was not peace, but preparation. The cane fields lay hushed under the moon, stalks swaying like rows of sentinels, as if the land itself were bracing for what was to come. In the slave huts, the air smelled of sweat, smoke, and iron. Faces glowed faintly in the firelight. Men sat sharpening machetes, their steady scraping a rhythm more ominous than drums. Women whispered prayers over the blades, pressing charms of feathers, herbs, and ash against the steel. This was no ordinary night. It was a night of oaths. In the shadows, they gathered around Tacky. His presence was as still and unyielding as carved stone, yet his eyes burned with the weight of history. Once a chief of the Akan, now a slave in Jamaica, he carried the memory of freedom like a wound that would never heal. And in this moment he stood not as a broken man of empire, but as the echo of warriors long dead. A calabash filled with rum was passed around, each man and woman drinking to seal their vow. Blood was pricked from fingertips and mixed into the soil, an offering to the ancestors. Words were spoken in Akan, low and steady, summoning gods and spirits to walk beside them. They swore to fight until death or freedom. No betrayal, no faltering, only steel, blood, and fire. Outside, the island seemed to hold its breath. Yet danger pressed close. Whispers of unrest had reached some overseers' ears. A few masters noted the unusual silence, the strange absences of tools, the unease in the air. Rumors slipped between plantations like shadows, hinting at something more than hunger thefts or burned cane. Yet arrogance blinded them. They dismissed the signs as idle mischief. The lash, they believed, had already broken any thought of rebellion. The scale of what brewed in the huts escaped their imagination. So the night stretched on, unseen preparations sharpening like knives in the dark. Then came the hour before dawn. The island was still draped in darkness, only the faint glow of the moon lighting the cane fields. While the planters slept in their fine houses and the chapels waited for Easter hymns, Tacky rose and gave the sign. They moved like shadows, hundreds of them armed with machetes, cutlasses, and whatever blades they could find. Feet pressed softly against dirt. Breath low and steady, eyes sharp with fury contained too long. Their silence was the silence of predators before the strike. The first to fall were the guards. Men stationed at the edge of plantations, complacent in their power, never imagined that the hands they whipped by day would slit their throats by night. Steel flashed in the dark. Throats opened. The ground drank their blood. Not a cry was allowed to escape. The guards fell into silence, their bodies hidden by cane. And then the storm broke. They moved on the planters' homes, the machetes gleaming faintly in the dawn's first light. Doors splintered beneath the weight of furious hands. Men and women poured inside. Their rage no longer whispers but screams. Masters were dragged from their beds, their silk nightclothes torn and painted red. Blood flooded across dirt floors and seeped into wooden boards. Walls that once rang with laughter and prayer now echoed with terror. 60 planters and overseers fell before the sun climbed into the sky. Some were cut down where they stood. Others chased through their homes, their pleas unanswered. The machetes swung with ritualistic precision, each stroke an answer to centuries of lashes, each drop of blood an offering to the ancestors invoked the night before. The air filled with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of smoke as torches were set to wood. Houses burned, their flames clawing at the sky. The screams of the dying mingled with the crackle of fire and the clash of steel. For the enslaved, this was not chaos but ceremony. Vengeance long delayed unleashed in the most sacred of hours. The rising sun broke over a land transformed. The fields of cane glistened with dew and with blood. Smoke curled upward from burning plantations. Vultures stirred in the sky, circling as though summoned by the scent of carnage. The empire's order had been torn open, and from its wound spilled a vision the masters had never imagined, their own blood soaking the soil they claimed to own. Tacky stood at the forefront, his machete dripping red, his face lit by the rising fire. In him the people saw more than a man. They saw the chief returned, the warrior reborn. Each strike he led was not only an act of vengeance but a signal. The empire could bleed, but even in that hour of triumph, shadows lingered. For every overseer who fell, for every planter cut down, there were others yet to rise in arms. The empire's soldiers slept only miles away, muskets ready, vengeance of their own stirring as word began to spread. Yet in this moment, this bloody, apocalyptic dawn, the enslaved did not see fear. They saw justice. They saw ancestors walking beside them. They saw chains breaking in the firelight. Jamaica's Easter of 1760 was no longer the Master's holy day. It was a day baptized in blood, a resurrection not of Christ, but of rebellion. And as the sun rose higher, painting the sky in gold and crimson, the island whispered its new truth. What began in whispers had ended in screams. The rebellion spread like wildfire. One plantation after another fell into chaos, their fields no longer green with cane but red with blood and black with smoke. The flames lit the horizon, casting eerie light across the night sky as if the island itself had been set ablaze. For the enslaved, this was a dawn they had prayed for in whispers and endured for centuries in chains. For the masters, it was the beginning of terror they had never thought possible. The news tore through Jamaica with the speed of lightning. Rumors became reports. Reports became panic. Dozens of planters lay dead, their houses smoldering, their families scattered or slain. Tacky's men swelled in number as more slaves abandoned the fields and took up arms. The sound of drums carried across the hills, calling others to rise, to take machetes and torches and finish what had begun. The British Empire stirred, startled from its arrogance. Soldiers were roused from their barracks, muskets pulled from racks and militias scrambled into action. Bells tolled in towns as fear rolled through the white population like a sickness. They had believed themselves untouchable, their power absolute. Now their empire shook beneath the boots of the enslaved. But even as soldiers marched, the rebellion pressed forward. Plantations went up in flames, black smoke thickening the sky until day seemed like night. Cane fields, once symbols of wealth, turned to ash under torches wielded by hands that had cut them for generations. Masters who tried to flee found themselves dragged back, their blood feeding the soil they had claimed as their own. The clashes came swift and brutal. Muskets roared, their smoke choking the air. But for every shot fired, a dozen machetes swung. Steel met flesh and screams drowned in the cacophony of battle. Tacky's men fought not as slaves, but as warriors, each swing of their blades echoing with the fury of ancestors long denied justice. It was said they fought with supernatural fury, their machetes blessed by Obeah priests, their bodies moving as if possessed by spirits of vengeance. Some struck down soldiers before they could even raise their muskets. Others charged through gunfire, heedless of wounds, as if the dead themselves walked with them. But muskets had range, and steel could not stop bullets. The rebels fell in droves, their bodies littering the cane fields they had sought to free. Blood turned furrows into rivers. Vultures circled above, waiting for the feasting that always followed war. The British response grew harsher with each day. Militias hunted the rebels across the hills and forests, tracking them like animals. Cannons fired into suspected hideouts and soldiers burned huts suspected of sheltering runaways. Betrayal crept into the rebellion. Some, broken under torture or tempted with promises of mercy, revealed names and places. Others were forced into it, their families held hostage, their bodies mutilated until the secrets spilled from their lips. The rebellion began to fracture. What had been a wave threatening to drown the island now broke into scattered currents, hunted and cornered. Still, Tacky fought, refusing surrender, his machete red with blood until the end. He retreated into the forests with his closest men, hiding in the thick canopy where the Empire's reach was weakest. For days, he evaded capture. Soldiers scoured the land, dogs sniffing for trails, muskets ready to fire at the first rustle of leaves. The forest became a labyrinth of survival, its shadows both shield and trap. Each night fires burned low, meals were meager, and the rebels whispered prayers to spirits who had carried them this far. But fate was closing in. Betrayal struck once more. Guided by informants, the British cornered him. Surrounded in the forest, cut off from escape, the last stand came. Muskets fired into the trees, smoke billowing through the branches. The machetes struck back, but the numbers were too great. One by one, his men fell, their bodies crumpling into the earth they had sworn to free. Tacky stood until the end, his blade glinting with defiance, his body a shadow of the chief he once was. When he fell, it was not as a slave, but as a warrior. His blood soaked into the Jamaican soil, mingling with the ash of burning fields and the blood of his fallen brothers. His body was claimed by death, but his defiance could not be buried. The Empire retaliated with merciless cruelty. Rebels who survived were executed, their heads severed and displayed on stakes as warnings. Forests echoed with the crack of muskets as fugitives were hunted. Women and children suspected of aiding the rebellion were flogged, branded, or chained. The planters reasserted their grip with iron, desperate to remind all who lived on the island of their power. Yet even in their terror, they could not erase what had happened. For a few days, Jamaica had burned with the fire of freedom. For a few days, the Empire trembled at the hands of those it called property. The rivers ran tinged with ash and blood. Vultures circled endlessly, their shadows cutting across the smoke-stained sky. Fields lay charred, their sugar gone, their profits turned to ruin. The land itself seemed scarred by the rebellion, haunted by what had been unleashed. Tacky was dead. His rebellion was broken, but his story lived. It passed from mouth to mouth, whispered in the huts at night, carried in the songs that rose when overseers were gone. He became a legend, not of defeat, but of defiance, a spirit lingering in every machete swung, in every song sung in secret, in every dream of freedom yet to come. For though the Empire had won the battle, it had lost something greater. It had revealed that its chains could break, that its blood could be spilled, that its power could be shaken. And so, though vultures feasted and rivers carried the dead, a seed remained in the soil of Jamaica, watered by blood, nourished by fire, waiting for its time to rise again. Jamaica, late 1760. The smoke had cleared, but its stench lingered in the cane fields. The rebellion was broken. British muskets had cracked through the silence, and the cries of the enslaved had been silenced with iron and fire. The Empire stood triumphant, or so it seemed. The aftermath was merciless. Heads were mounted on poles along the roads, blackened by sun and flies. Silent warnings to every slave who passed by. The bodies of Tacky's followers, men who had once sung freedom into the night, now swung from gallows. Their corpses twisted in the hot wind above the very plantations they had sought to burn to ash. The overseers and masters returned, scarred but unbroken, tightening their grip with chains heavier than before. Yet something had shifted. Though the rebellion was crushed, it had left an imprint deeper than any musket ball, more enduring than any plantation's foundation. For in the minds of the enslaved, Tacky was no longer just a man. He was a spirit, a whisper, a seed planted in blood. At night, when the fields quieted and the overseer's footsteps faded into distance, the songs began again. Low, almost imperceptible, sung under breath as if carried by the soil itself. Akan melodies, part prayer, part memory, rose softly into the darkness. They sang not of chains, but of chiefs and warriors, of men who had once ruled before the ships carried them west into bondage. Tacky's name moved through those songs like a hidden drumbeat, his story told and retold until it blurred into legend. The British thought they had silenced rebellion. Instead, they had birthed a ghost that haunted the sugar fields, that lived in every shadow cast by the burning torches, that spoke in the rustle of cane under moonlight. The planters walked their lands with renewed caution, for though muskets had killed men, they could not kill memory. And memory in Jamaica was more dangerous than any weapon. For the enslaved, Tacky's rebellion became both wound and weapon. Mothers whispered his story to their children as they hushed them to sleep. Old men recounted the Easter dawn when 60 masters fell before the Machetes' edge, their voices thick with pride and sorrow. Women carried charms blessed in secret, invoking the spirits that had once guided Tacky's blade. Each whisper was an act of defiance, each story a spark against the suffocating darkness of empire. The empire had always thrived on silence. Silence of the oppressed, silence of history. But silence is fragile. Tacky had shattered it. What began as a quiet breath in the cane fields had become a scream that echoed beyond death. The British could not erase it, no matter how many bodies they displayed, no matter how much blood they spilled. Years passed. The plantations rebuilt. The sugar flowed once more across the seas, feeding the empire's hunger. But in the soil of Jamaica, something restless remained. Every Easter, the date of the rebellion stirred unease among the masters. They tightened patrols. They watched the huts more closely. They prayed more fervently in their churches. But beneath their hymns they heard it, the memory of Machetes, the echo of rebellion. Tacky's story refused burial. It was not confined to Jamaica alone. Whispers crossed waters, carried by enslaved people traded from island to island. The name became a warning to masters and a promise to slaves, that chains could be broken, that fire could spread, that silence could become screams again. The rebellion had ended, but freedom had been born in its ashes. Not immediate, not visible, not yet, but it lived smoldering, waiting for the winds of time. And when the great abolition movements rose, when revolutions shook Haiti, when emancipation finally crawled across the Caribbean, the ghost of Tacky was there, guiding unseen. His machete, though buried, still glinted in memory, and so the empire's victory was hollow. They had crushed a body, but they could not kill a story. They had silenced voices, but they could not quiet the earth that remembered. For every cane stalk that swayed in the fields, every drop of sweat that fell upon the soil, every hymn sung in hushed defiance, carried with it the ghost of rebellion. Tacky's fate, death, dishonor in the eyes of empire was not his end. His true life began after death, in the imagination of the enslaved, in the whispered tales passed from hut to hut, from night to night. He became myth, spirit, a warning and a promise all at once. The oppressors saw a failure. The oppressed saw a seed, and so Jamaica lived with a dual truth. The fields returned to labor, but the soil beneath them remembered blood. The masters returned to power, but their shadows lengthened with fear. The enslaved bent their backs again, but their hearts carried a quiet fire. Did Tacky lose, or did he win in a way the empire could never understand? The answer lies not in the gallows or the guns, but in the whispers that still move through the island. The sugar fields returned to silence. But beneath the soil, in every cane stalk that swayed, the memory of Tacky whispered still, reminding the empire that chains could never silence fire.